honourable friend. She's doing a fantastic job for her constituents. The Employment Rights Bill is the biggest upgrade to workers' rights in a generation. That will benefit more than 10 million workers in every corner of the country. It will tackle low pay, poor conditions and poor job security that hold our country back. It is pro-worker, pro-business and pro-growth.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Bernal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Divisions between Ukraine and the US only serve Vladimir Putin. President Zelenskyy is right to try and rebuild his relationship with President Trump. He is keeping a cool head under very difficult circumstances. And I was glad to see President Trump receive his letter positively. What is the Prime Minister doing to help rebuild their relationship after a challenging week?
Minister.
Well, she's absolutely right that we need to do everything we can to ensure that the US, Europe and Ukraine are working together on lasting peace. And I'm doing everything I can to play my part in that, in regular contact with all of the key players at the moment, including talking to President Zelenskyy yesterday afternoon.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for that answer. All of us in this House know that the British Armed Forces are a huge source of pride to our country. They put themselves in harm's way to defend our values. As the opposition, we support efforts to resolve this conflict, but we cannot write a blank check. If British peacekeeping troops in Ukraine were attacked, whether directly or via proxies, we could be drawn into conflict with Russia. Can the Prime Minister reassure all those who are concerned about the UK being drawn into war?
Minister.
Yes, that's the last thing anybody wants to see. And the whole point of ensuring that there's a lasting peace and that any deal, if there's a deal, is defended, is to avoid conflict, to ensure that we do have peace. The way to ensure we have peace is to ensure there are guarantees for any deal that is in place, because the surest risk that there will be conflict is if Putin thinks that he can breach any deal that may be arrived at.
The Prime Minister is quite right, and we on this side of the House agree with him. The objective for his visit to Washington was to get that US security guarantee for Ukraine, and I commend his efforts in this very difficult task. But nonetheless, on Monday, the United States withdrew military aid for Ukraine. Can he update the House on the steps he is taking to persuade America that it is also in their national interest to provide a security guarantee?
Prime Minister.
I'm pleased to inform the House that on Thursday of last week we did discuss security guarantees. The President made absolutely clear his commitment to Article 5 of NATO, absolutely clear that he would have our backs because of the relationship between our parties, and agreed that our teams would sit down together to talk through security guarantees. I've spoken to him, I think, 3 times since then on the telephone, because it is vitally important that we work with the US, with Europe and Ukraine and make sure that if there is a deal, it has proper security guarantees in place.
Kemi Bernal.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is not able to comment on specific intelligence matters, and I'm certainly not asking him to do that. However, there are concerning reports that the United States has instructed Britain to suspend intelligence sharing with Ukraine, and other reports that Five Eyes itself may be at risk. We need to make sure America does not disengage. There are some in this House who argue Europe should go it alone. But does he agree with me that without this country's greatest ally, any peace agreement would place a terrible burden on Britain and our taxpayers?
Prime Minister.
Well, I do agree with her wholeheartedly, and that's why in the debate we had just 2 days ago, I've always been clear that we need to ensure that the US, the UK, Europe and Ukraine are working together, but we must not choose between the US and Europe. We never have historically, and we're not going to do so now.
Kemi Bernal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his comments on that. He will know that it is not just the security situation that worries people. They are also concerned about trade wars and the economic impact of tariffs like those leveled on Canada and Mexico yesterday. The best way to avoid America putting tariffs on Britain is to reach agreement on a US trade deal. Following the Prime Minister's trip to Washington, have talks on a UK-US trade deal begun?
Prime Minister.
Well, I was pleased in the meeting I had last week that we did discuss an economic deal and agreed that our teams would indeed sit down rapidly to talk through an economic deal, and that is what they're doing, because, as she rightly says, that is far better than getting drawn into conflict in relation to tariffs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the Prime Minister has confirmed that those talks have started. People across our country are worried. They're worried about national security. They're worried about whether we can equip our military fast enough. They are worried about whether we will deploy troops in Ukraine and whether we will be able to keep the peace. They are also worried about our economic security. Can we afford all this? The world is changing fast, and we need an entirely new approach to our economy and our energy security. The budget last year halted growth with higher taxes and higher borrowing. Yesterday, farmers were protesting in Whitehall again. People are hurting. Will he now change course so we can have the economic security we know we need for our national security?
Prime Minister.
We were doing so well. What we inherited was insecurity in our economy. We inherited a 22 billion black hole, and we have now turned that around. We've got the highest investment coming into our economy. We've got wages higher than prices. We've got 3 times interest rates have been cut. That's the difference between stability with Labour and instability with the party opposite.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Prime Minister for his decisive leadership that he has shown in Europe and at home to bolster our collective security. The £13.4 billion increase in defence spending has been very much welcomed in my constituency of Stevenage. Can the Prime Minister outline how that increase in defence spending will boost jobs and growth in places like Stevenage, and would he like to join me in visiting some of those businesses?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question. Our plan for change is built on national security, and that has to go hand in hand with economic security. And as we're returning to 2.5% for the first time since a Labour government, that investment must mean UK skills, UK jobs and UK apprenticeships. And I was very pleased that on Monday we were able to announce a new hub, a new spending targets to help 12,000 SMEs access the supply chain, which will boost economic growth, and that'll be really important in so many constituencies. And of course, I'll consider his invitation.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I visited Kingston's Army Reserve Centre, met members of the Royal Army Medical Service who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan very bravely. So can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's initial remarks? On Monday, the Prime Minister rightly said a minerals deal only was not a sufficient security guarantee for Ukraine. But since then, the Trump administration has said that a minerals deal is the only guarantee on the table, and President Trump has removed military aid from Ukraine and said that the British cannot share American intelligence with Kyiv. Both those decisions mean more brave Ukrainians will die and further embolden Vladimir Putin. So can the Prime Minister tell the House, does he still believe that President Trump is a reliable ally? And if Ukraine does not get a sufficient security guarantee from this White House, what is the Prime Minister's plan B?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, look, we work very closely with the United States on defence, on security and on intelligence. We have done for many, many years. We're intertwined, and of course they're a reliable ally. We are operating on that basis day in, day out across the world, as he knows. In relation to the situation as it develops, obviously our main focus, our only focus, is on a lasting peace in Ukraine. There are many moving parts, there are many discussions to be had, but what I'm doing is staying focused on what I think is the single most important outcome, which is a lasting peace in Ukraine, which is good for Ukraine, for Europe, and of course essential for the United Kingdom.
Sir Ed Davey.
The Prime Minister knows we all support him in that effort. But can I take him back to President Trump's reliability? 4 British women have accused Andrew Tate of rape and human trafficking, and British police have issued arrest warrants. The Tates have tried to escape justice, first to Romania, now to the United States, but I'm delighted that Florida has thankfully opened a criminal investigation. But does the Prime Minister agree that people who are wanted by British police of such appalling crimes should stand trial in our country? And given his assessment that President Trump really is a reliable ally, will his government request an urgent extradition of the Tate brothers?
Prime Minister.
This is a live issue, as he'll appreciate, and therefore I'll tread carefully. But the principle is absolutely clear. Justice must be done in all cases, including in this case. But I won't go into the details because this is a live case, as he knows.
Steve Race.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm supporting many parents in Exeter who are struggling to get the support they need for their children within the SEND system run by Devon County Council. One parent told me that their child was excelling, but after undergoing major surgery, she needed additional support to get back into a mainstream school setting. That hasn't been possible due to the disarray of the SEND system in Devon, and this child is now missing out. I welcome the new money going to the system. Can the Prime Minister provide an update on government work that will also reform the SEND system to make sure every child in Exeter has the best start in life?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank him for raising this familiar topic. We inherited a SEND system that failed to meet the needs of children and families, and that's why we're investing £1 billion in SEND alongside £740 million for councils to improve inclusivity and expertise in mainstream schools and to make sure special schools can cater for children with the most complex needs. We're working closely with partners in Devon to deliver an accelerated progress plan and have deployed SEND advisors to offer support to the local authority.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
By cozying up to Putin, Trump is making Europe less safe. We all recognise the need for Europe to adapt. Germany is changing its fiscal rules to boost investment in defence and infrastructure, creating a €500 billion fund to strengthen its future. Will the Prime Minister please consider a similar approach, focusing on strategic investment rather than imposing further hardship on the poorest through cuts to welfare and cuts to international aid?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as she knows, I think it's very important if we're to increase defence spending, which we are, to have that fully costed, fully funded, and to put that plan before the House, which is what I did last week. But she talks about fiscal rules, she talks about funding. I have to say, it was highly regrettable that Plaid voted against £1.6 billion to fund public services in Wales. She needs to explain how that helps her constituents and the people of Wales.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This year marks 40 years since the Swan Report exposed systemic racism and discrimination in the education system. And regrettably, none of those recommendations were implemented. One of the most damning injustices in that report was the misclassification of mainly black children as educationally subnormal, as identified in Steve McKean's BBC documentary. And given the historic nature of this and the impact it had on so many, will the Prime Minister consider a public inquiry to provide justice and recompense for those who have been affected?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising this really important issue. All children, young people, must be treated fairly, and there's no place for hate or prejudice in our education system. I'll make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss this further.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, President Trump has ended military aid to Ukraine, reportedly banned the UK sharing US intelligence for Ukraine, and is now seeking to lift sanctions with Russia to appease Vladimir Putin, a murderous, lying dictator. Regrettably, it's clear for now the US can no longer be relied upon for security and peace in Europe. So will the Prime Minister provide leadership to our allies by urgently making the decision to be the first leader to release seized Russian state assets to Ukraine under the established principle of international law, so that Putin must pay as the aggressor?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on the question of assets, obviously we're using the profits, the interest on the assets to help fund Ukraine, and we are looking with others at whether it's possible to go further, and obviously I'll update the House if that's possible. But I have to say, at a time when defence and security in Europe, in the UK, needs to be ramped up for all the reasons that he readily understands, for the SNP to maintain its position that it wants to get rid of the single most effective deterrent that we have, the nuclear deterrent, really has to be explained in its historical context.
Paul Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour is rolling out free breakfast clubs in primary schools, starting with 750 schools, including Scapegoat Hill Junior Infants School in my constituency. Under the Tories, only 1 in 10 schools had these clubs. Labour will make them available for all children. This will help break down barriers to opportunity for every child. I know the Prime Minister is as determined as I am to tear away the link between background and success. So will you update the House on how we are going to do that through Labour's plan for change?
Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question. Labour promised free breakfast clubs in every primary school, and the first 750 will open in April, giving every child the best start in life through our plan for change. It will also put up to £450 a year back in the pockets of working families. I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, to say that 2 of the breakfast clubs will be opening in the constituency of the Leader of the Opposition in April, and I hope she'll welcome them when they do.
Ian Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the Prime Minister talked about creating defence jobs across the country as we rebuild our defence industrial capacity. So will he and the government bring forward an urgent plan for skills in the defence sector? And does he agree with his Education Secretary that the strategy for defence skills should sit purely under the Department for Education and an underpowered executive agency?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this because it is a duty to increase our spending on defence and security, but it also does provide an opportunity for jobs across the country, and that's good jobs, well-paid jobs, skilled jobs, as he rightly identifies, but also jobs with a real sense of pride, and we are working on that.
Emma Lulberg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My lovely granddad, John Henry Richardson, passed away in 1998 from work-related asbestos exposure. Today in South Shields, we have one of the highest death rates from this silent killer in the United Kingdom. Will the Prime Minister please look at introducing a national digital register so we know where this asbestos is and commit to a phased removal of it from public buildings?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm sure I speak for the whole House when I say I'm very sorry to hear what happened to her grandfather. These are just awful cases, and the deaths are terrible. I've no doubt he was a wonderful man. He would have been, no doubt, very proud to have seen her in her place today. And I'll make sure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
Sir Oliver Dundon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. St Hilda's Girls' School looks set to join Emmanuel Jewish Prep as the second school in Bushey alone forced to close because of Labour's VAT hike. This is a double hit to aspiration. First, the parents, many of whom not wealthy, who have described the significant sacrifices they have made to send their children to these schools. And secondly, to the excellent local state schools, including the one that I attended, which simply do not have the places, meaning this policy won't even save money. So may I therefore urge the Prime Minister, even at this late stage, to look again at the failures in this policy.
Prime Minister.
I don't doubt the aspirations of all parents in relation to their children. But I mean all parents. What we've been able to do is to make sure we release the funding to ensure that our state secondary schools have the teachers they need. And there's no point the party opposite pretending that they're interested in state education when they left them without the teaching they needed.
Dr. Ray Ball.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There is no punchline. I presume something was said that shouldn't have been said. I'm sure the member would like to withdraw what was said, if they've anything about them. withdrawn. There we are. Let's carry on. Dr. Maria Timbon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 48 children that we know of have been killed by known domestically abusive parents during court-permitted contact visits, including Paul and Jack Seitz, who were tragically murdered at the hands of their father in a house fire. Their mother, my constituent Claire Throssell, has campaigned against the presumption of contact, which allows such abusers to have unsupervised contact with their children. Will the Prime Minister meet with Claire and I to discuss the urgent need to remove the presumption of contact in law?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend and to my honourable friend, the member for Calder Valley, who've both raised this critical issue? And can I particularly pay tribute to Claire? Her courage and strength is outstanding. Mr. Speaker, family courts must never be used as a tool that domestic abusers can use to continue their appalling abuse. And we're expanding a number of pathfinder courts to protect the welfare of children and reviewing the presumption of involvement that she raises.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Daniel Coffey from Columpton lost his life while serving in Iraq. His grandfather said yesterday that Vice President J.D. Vance should have a lot more respect for those who lost their lives, in response to the Vance comment that some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. Will the Prime Minister gently remind the US government that the UK was there for the US following the 9/11 attacks when Lord Robertson invoked Article 5, and that we were there for the US for the intervention in Iraq? And they might remember our long-standing friendship when we think about security guarantees for Ukraine.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this. I know he speaks for the whole House. We do remember the role that we've played historically with our allies, and we particularly remember those that made the ultimate sacrifice in that duty for their country and for our allies, and that's why it's so important that we make that point today.
Parin Moon.
Muraz Gul Peran Lowen. Happy St. Piran's Day, Mr. Speaker. To the hundreds of thousands of people in Cornwall and around the world who are today celebrating St. Piran's Day, will the Prime Minister confirm our government's commitment to national minority status for Cornwall, and will he join me in wishing Cornish folk the world over a very happy St. Piran's Day?
Prime Minister.
Well, yes, let me wish him, his constituents and everyone in Cornwall a very happy St. Piran's Day. We do recognise Cornish national minority status, not just the language, the history and the culture of Cornwall, but its bright future. And I know that he and Cornish colleagues will continue to be powerful voices for Cornwall.
Sir David Davis.
Four weeks ago, the Northern Ireland coroner accused British soldiers of unlawful killing after they engaged with IRA would-be murderers. After careful reading, as far as I can see, this judgment was based on no evidence whatsoever. Over 100 Special Forces soldiers have been summoned before these inquiries. Not one IRA leader has been summoned in the same way. Soldiers that serve our country with honour, heroism and skill are being punished in their declining years for doing nothing but carrying out their patriotic duty facing enormous risks. Now, given how he opened his comments today, which I associate myself with, does he not think that he and his government have a duty to protect these soldiers from such partisan parodies of justice in their declining years?
On the particular case, the coroner's ruling, I just haven't seen the details, I'm afraid, so I can't comment on that. On the broader point, it's right that we should protect those who serve our country, wherever they serve our country. Getting the balance right is critically important. I didn't think that the legislation that was put forward by the party opposite achieved that, but nonetheless, I do believe that in the interests of everybody in Northern Ireland, all those who served and all those who are victims, we do need to renew our efforts to find a way forward on this really important issue.
Helena Dollywell.
Mr Speaker, my constituents in Hastings Rye and the villages are fed up with the constant failures of Southern Water, dumping sewage in our sea, flooding and leaving us without water for days, all while taking huge bonuses. At the Environment Select Committee, we've been hauling in the water bosses one by one and hearing about their failures. But the boss of Southern Water there finally agreed to give my constituents millions in compensation for a major water outage. Can the Prime Minister tell me how this Labour government is cracking down on the bad behaviour of the water industry?
Can I applaud her for her dedicated work on the Environment Committee and obviously in her constituency. Last week, our Water Act became law, which gives new powers to ban the payment of bonuses for polluting water bosses and bringing criminal charges against lawbreakers. We are determined, Mr Speaker, to fix our broken water system after years of companies pumping sewage into our waterways and infrastructure not keeping pace with demand.
Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I pay tribute to the Prime Minister for his efforts to bring Europe together and ensure we can work to restore peace in Ukraine. What the war in Ukraine has also demonstrated, though, is the need for greater food security and stronger supply chains. But if this government forces our farmers to sell their land because of the divisive family farm tax, then it undermines this. So ahead of the spring statement, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, will he think this policy through again and seek to end it? Because national security needs food security, it needs farming and it needs farmers.
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we put a record amount in the budget into farming, £5 billion. We've set out a roadmap for farming, which has been welcomed across by the NFU. And as she knows, the vast majority of farms will not be affected by the provisions that we're putting in place.
Lee Pitcher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. For months, my constituents in Doncaster East and Isle of Axholme have been telling me how fed up they are with not being able to get an appointment because of the 8 a.m. scramble. The last thing they need when they're ill is to have to pick up that phone and wait and fight again to be first. It's great news that the government's new GP contract will start to resolve this. But can the Prime Minister reassure my residents who can't use technology that they will still be able to book an appointment?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for this. Last week, for the first time in 4 years, the BMA agreed the GP contract with the government worth an extra £889 million. Patients will be able to request appointments online from October, but I can absolutely reassure my honourable friend and others that this will free up the phones for those who need them most and help end the 8 a.m. scramble.
Rosie Duffy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Under his Labour government, does the Prime Minister believe the UK's estimated 3 million millionaires should contribute more to our vital national security? Or is it just the world's poorest by no longer benefiting from our international aid programmes, or the shameful almost 6 million children living in poverty in this country who should be paying for it? What happened to the wealth tax, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
Well, I think all should and all do make a contribution at this vital time.
Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. These are delicate moments for the country, and the Prime Minister has led with British values, moral courage, decency, as a true statesman, and with skilled and careful diplomacy. All elected politicians in this House, Mr Speaker, must appreciate that everything we say could impact that diplomacy. Does the Prime Minister agree that a united House could help us achieve that lasting peace?
Well, let me broaden out his words to the whole House, because I do think that it's hugely to the credit of this House that it is speaking loudly in a united way with one voice in the face of Russian aggression. And that is why we must have lasting peace based on the sovereignty and security of Ukraine. But it certainly helps to all of those observing across the world to see this House speaking powerfully with one voice, united across these benches, and I'm very pleased that we're able to continue in that way.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Scottish fishing industry, by volume and value, is the biggest in these islands. And within my constituency, the port towns of Peterhead and Fraserburgh representing a very large share of that industry in terms of the land it catch and its processing. Now, I'm sure the Prime Minister enjoys the occasional fish supper. So does he agree that their interests and their future must be secured and enhanced as his government pursues economic growth and resets its relationship with the European Union, especially through the forthcoming trade and cooperation agreement negotiations, so that the jobs of the people who work in this sector can never be made expendable for the sake of some other interest?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank you for raising this, and do recognise the huge and historic importance of the fishing industry in his constituency and others. I'm determined to make the sector more secure, sustainable and economically successful. We've already secured over 720,000 tonnes of fishing quota for the year, worth up to £920 million, including agreements with the EU and with Norway. We also want to tackle problems about labour shortages that he will be familiar with. I'm pleased that his constituents in Peterhead will benefit from £20 million under our plan for neighbourhood, but absolutely do everything we can in relation to this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Medway Maritime Hospital in my constituency of Gillingham and Raynham has today received a very concerning CQC report following an inspection of the emergency department in February last year. Testimonies include patients having to wait up to 50 hours to be seen, and others being told to soil themselves because there were staff that were not available to take them to the bathroom. Will the Prime Minister please outline what this government will urgently do to tackle the crisis in our NHS after 14 years of absolute Tory mismanagement?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank her for raising this case. Her constituents deserve the highest standard of care. The party opposite left the NHS in an absolutely dire state. We're investing £26 billion, and our reform plan will cut waiting lists. And I'm really pleased, Mr. Speaker, to say that waiting lists are down, and we've delivered over 2 million extra appointments to get the NHS back on its feet.
Final question, Richard Holden.
Thank you very much. A marriage between first cousins carries significant health issues, many of which aren't even knowable until post-birth. When practiced generation after generation, there is a significant multiplier effect. In addition, the real impacts for the openness of our society and women's rights in our country are also significant. After all, there are significant dynamics in sharing a same set of grandparents. On Friday, this government has a choice to let my bill go through to ban first cousin marriage to committee stage. Will the Prime Minister think again before instructing his whips to block this legislation?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've taken our position on that bill. Thank you.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
Well, that does conclude Prime Minister's questions. Let's pick through it with our political editor, Beth Rigby, who is here in the studio. Quite a different tone in this week's Prime Minister's questions, Beth. And at the beginning, quite interesting that the Prime Minister chose to remember British troops who died while fighting for their allies. A pointed rebuke to JD Vance, perhaps?
Well, it was interesting. He started off, as you said, Jane, saying tomorrow marks 13 years since 6 young British soldiers on patrol in Afghanistan were killed. And then he names those soldiers. And yes, a Prime Minister who I've been watching closely for a week now since his trip to the White House, who has assiduously avoided any public criticism of President Trump or any of the more outlandish or controversial things that have been said and done in the past week. And I think, yes, that is obliquely a Prime Minister who is trying to get a point across without directly criticising. And this, I think, relates to JD Vance, the Vice President. He did an interview on Fox News where he talked about peacekeeping soldiers in armies that hadn't fought for 30 or 40 years. And then he said afterwards, I wasn't referring to the British or the French, that I had been misrepresented. This is what JD Vance has said. But of course, the only two countries that have formally said that they would put forward peacekeeping troops are Britain and France. And of course, that created a lot of upset yesterday as people were quick to point out to the US that British troops had fought with the US, that the only time that Article 5 of NATO had been invoked was after September the 11th. And there was a lot of anger about that. And I think the Prime Minister there was trying to make that point and acknowledging that without going toe-to-toe with President Trump, because we've seen what can happen if he is openly challenged.
And many of the other questions from Kemi Badenoch were about what's happened in the last week and about whether he's concerned about the UK being drawn into war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised. I'll be honest, Jane, I was a bit surprised by this Prime Minister's questions because we had the farming protests outside in Westminster yesterday. Rachel Reeves is now looking towards the spending review at the end of the month, and she's going to have to cut spending, having said that she wouldn't, and that the budget of last year was enough to deliver growth, and then growth has been anaemic. So there's a lot to go on there for Kemi Badenoch on the economy. And she did have one little go at it at the end where the Prime Minister said, oh, it was going so well, in a slight dig at the fact, well, not dig, but a sort of wry acknowledgement that for the first section of PMQ, she actually asked him questions about Ukraine, about the relationship with Trump. Much of the ground had been gone over earlier in the week, and there wasn't really anything to divide them.
Well, let's have a listen to that, because addressing the war in Ukraine, Kemi Badenoch asked the Prime Minister what he was doing to help rebuild the relationship between Ukraine and the US after a challenging week. The Leader of the Opposition began with a question about possible threats on British peacekeeping forces.
If British peacekeeping troops in Ukraine were attacked, whether directly or via proxies, we could be drawn into conflict with Russia. Can the Prime Minister reassure all those who are concerned about the UK being drawn into war?
Minister.
Yes, that's the last thing anybody wants to see. And the whole point of ensuring that there's a lasting peace and that any deal, if there's a deal, is defended, is to avoid conflict, to ensure that we do have peace. The way to ensure we have peace is to ensure there are guarantees for any deal that is in place, because the surest risk that there will be conflict is if Putin thinks that he can breach any deal that may be arrived at.
Does he agree with me that without this country's greatest ally, any peace agreement would place a terrible burden on Britain and our taxpayers?
Prime Minister.
Well, I do agree with her wholeheartedly, and that's why in the debate we had just 2 days ago, I've always been clear that we need to ensure that the US, the UK, Europe and Ukraine are working together, but we must not choose between the US and Europe. We never have historically, and we're not going to do so now.
It did feel, Beth, a little bit like someone had taken Kemi Badenoch's batteries out.
Yeah, look, I mean, also, all of the things that the Prime Minister said at Prime Minister's questions are his lines to take, if you like. What I've noticed with Keir Starmer is he has been so cautious around not saying anything to in any way ruffle the feathers of President Trump. But what was interesting about Kemi Badenoch's question there is the issue of security guarantees, because it's been one of the blocks that Ukraine had in this minerals deal. I mean, now they are ready to sign because Trump has upped the ante and now paused military aid, and Zelenskyy responded by saying, I will sign that minerals deal. There's now talk that Macron, Starmer and Zelenskyy might go over to the White House in short order, is the way that the French President's official spokeswoman put it earlier today, to try and sign some sort of ceasefire deal. And he's now prepared to sign the minerals deal. But part of the concerns for President Zelenskyy were the security guarantees, i.e. that the backstop would be the US military might if Putin did not agree or keep the terms of a ceasefire. Our Prime Minister went over to the White House, and the big ask going in was to try and get President Trump to agree some of these security guarantees. They would be things like air protection from the US if necessary. and intelligence sharing, etc., etc. And President Trump, in the meetings with our Prime Minister in the Oval Office, when he was asked about it repeatedly, kept saying things like, we've got to get a deal and then we'll work that stuff out later. He's not committing to security guarantees. It doesn't mean they won't get there, but actually Badenoch is actually pressing on something that really is vital, because it's chicken and egg, if you like. Without security guarantees, the Prime Minister will not feel confident about putting peacekeeping soldiers from the UK into Ukraine. So she's picking on a very live subject, but in a way that she's not really pressing the Prime Minister on it. She's just acknowledging it. So she could have gone a bit harder on that. But I think it's because there's a consensus in the UK at the moment that actually we don't need to be arguing around Ukraine and a possible peace deal when Zelensky and Trump are so at odds. And actually people need to come together and try not to make an already very tense and delicate situation even worse.
Interesting stuff. Beth, thanks very much. Well, let's bring in our panel today to see what they thought about it. We've got the Labour MP for Derby North, Catherine Atkinson. We've got the Conservative MP for Exmouth and Exeter East, that is David Reid, and also the Lib Dem MP for Sutton and Cheam, Luke Taylor. Great to see you all. Catherine, to you first of all, how do you feel Starmer is dealing with President Trump and all that's gone on the last week?
I think we live in serious times. I think that was a serious PMQs reflective of that. And I think what was really important is we did see the whole House standing in support of our Prime Minister's actions and the actions of this government. He's been absolutely clear that Britain has always stood in solidarity with and stood shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine and will continue to do so for as long as is necessary. I think that's particularly important because Ukrainian security is European security. It is British security. I think if Putin is allowed to act with impunity, then no one is safe. So I think that absolute commitment that we saw, not only to increasing defence spending to 2.5% in future to 3%, is absolutely essential and is the biggest sustained investment in defence since the Cold War. My husband served in Afghanistan alongside NATO troops, alongside US troops, and it is something that we do need to work together on to ensure that we get that lasting peace.
Well, Catherine, can I jump in? Do you mind, Jay? I mean, were you upset by JD Vance's remarks on Fox News? And did you think that the Prime Minister was trying to reference that at the beginning of Prime Minister's questions? Well, I think your husband served there.
I think it's important that JD Vance has said that he didn't mean British or French troops. Certainly, I have first-hand experience. I think our forces are the best in the world. I think when it comes to their commitment and their skills and their bravery, they have the full confidence of the entire House. And I think it was really important that our Prime Minister recognised those who paid the ultimate sacrifice in defence of our country and defence of peace around the world.
David, for the Conservatives, Kemi Badenoch did ask a number of questions about Ukraine and talked about our troops. She wouldn't condemn JD Vance's comments yesterday, though, would she?
So, the way I see it, JD Vance is a former US Marine. I'm a former Royal Marine. I served in Afghanistan with the US Marines. He will know implicitly the sacrifice that both countries have shared after 9/11 and after Article 5 was invoked. The key point for me is things will be really busy in the foreign policy space for the coming months. Now, we can get bogged down as parliamentarians talking about the weather, or we can actually look at how the wind blows and making sure that the wind blows in terms of our national security. That's what we really need to be focusing on now, and that's where the hard thought needs to be put into.
But doesn't Kemi Badenoch need to call out other leaders if they are saying things that are wrong? We know we saw other members of your party, people like James Cleverly, talking out in much stronger terms about JD Vance and what he'd said.
The Vice President rolled back very quickly on his remarks, and I saw how that played out on X. But it goes back to that fundamental point for me, is that what we really need to be discussing is what security guarantees look like for Ukraine, what our defence posture looks like, our defence spending. Those are the issues that I'm going to be focused on going forwards.
Luke, you're all nodding when we're talking about how great British troops are, but do you think the UK should be taking a tougher stance with Trump and with Vance? Are we being too supine?
I mean, just on the JD Vance point, I think Richard Ford made the point in his question. Sir Ed has made the point previously about recognising our troops. Helen Maguire made the point very well in the media over the last couple of days. We made it very clear that needs to be reflected. I don't think we're being too supine. I don't think Trump will deal well with that. You know, he is a strong man. You need to stand up to the strong man. You need to project force. You need to project strength. And I think Starmer has done well to do that. I think Macron did well to do that. But it does boil down to, and both the comments already have said it, is about the security guarantees. Sir Ed brought that up in his questions. It's about what security guarantees can we give to the Ukraine? Can the US give, in the same way as we invoked Article 5 after the September 11th attacks, to protect security in Europe so that we can see a peace, because that's the only way that Putin will react. He will react to strength, and that's what we have to show.
But when, Luke, when when Ed Davey, though, asked the Prime Minister if Trump's an unreliable ally, I actually asked him that myself on Sunday at the press conference, because it's something people are talking about, like you cannot rely on the US, and then we saw it play out as they paused security guarantees. In a way, Ed Davey's doing that for an audience where you think you can appeal to voters that don't like what Donald Trump's doing, because does Ed Davey really expect the Prime Minister to say he was an unreliable ally? If he said on Sunday, he clearly wasn't going to go there on Sunday, so why did you think he might go there today?
Well, I mean, let's be clear, this isn't just for voters, this is because it's the right thing to do. To stand up to Trump for things that he's done and said is the right thing to do. We've all spoken, and again, David made the point well, that we can all comment on the weather, we can comment on particular things that Trump said, that Vance has said, but, you know, by the afternoon, something else will have been done and things will have changed again. But we talk about the weather, we talk about, you know, the climate, and the climate is that we need to be supporting Ukraine. The US is giving the warm enough words that we're confident we can find a way to get the security guarantees. The mineral deal will have to have some protection for American citizens. I think there's a path there. We just need to make sure that we keep the pressure on so that those clear and confident security guarantees are included in it.
David, are you confident? There was talk in PMQs about whether or not we should be sharing intelligence with Ukraine, but isn't the bigger concern, should we be sharing intelligence with America at this point in time? Could what we be telling America be going to Russia?
The Americans are our closest ally in terms of defence, intelligence.
But do you still trust them?
The partnership is very strong. Now, what I find interesting is that the Republican Party went through the hard thinking and they looked at where their foreign policy aims were going to be before they were elected, and they told the world. We knew that they would be moving back and looking at Iran and looking at China, and that's played out now in their cyber operations. They made the announcement. They want us to look at Russia. That is a long-term strategic threat for us, and they're getting us to stamp up with us. If we want to protect Western values, which is all what JD Vance's speech was recently, then we need to look at Russia, and they will look at other threats that concern them.
Catherine, in terms of the UK being drawn into war in Ukraine, how concerned are you that that is a real prospect, that we are going to see British troops on the ground?
Well, I think our Prime Minister's made it absolutely clear that the first priority, the first duty of any government is national security, and therefore ensuring that we have the capabilities to gear up is something that is an absolute focus. And I mean, I'm a Derby MP, so certainly when people were talking about the nuclear deterrent and its importance, Derby creates the reactors that powers our submarines. But I think that national security and our economic security do go hand in hand in this. And I think that the focus that we have also seen on ensuring that smaller and medium-sized companies are able to ensure that they are playing a part in making sure that we can meet our defence capabilities and playing a part in the supply chain is really important.
But the government obviously will want to make it clear the benefits that there could be to the UK from this, but there's also the cost. And we saw Rosie Duffield there, Labour MP, raising the question about the aid reduction, which is still a problem for many Labour backbenchers. Why is the Prime Minister not bringing in a wealth tax? And the 6 million children in poverty in the UK. There will be people who will be watching this and saying it seems that we have a never-ending fund when it comes to Ukraine and the British taxpayer is being expected to foot the bill?
I think the government was really clear that it was a really difficult decision, but an essential one. And the most important thing is we get that durable and lasting peace deal, but it has been made clear that they're willing to back that up with boots on the ground and planes in the sky.
Catherine, though, I mean, there was a decision taken at speed the weekend before last to accelerate defence spending in order that the Prime Minister could go to President Trump and he had an offer on UK defence spending. That is what happened. It wasn't put to the Cabinet, it was kind of a done deal, and then it happened, and it breaks a manifesto commitment. And now we've got a Chancellor who later in the month is going to announce a series of other spending cuts, breaking other manifesto commitments. Are you worried about that?
What our Chancellor has been absolutely fundamentally clear about is that there is no negotiation when it comes to our fiscal rules. And that's important because we have seen what happens, and it is the most vulnerable that end up paying when you lose control of a budget, and we end up with something like we saw under Truss. So that fiscal responsibility is absolutely essential. But everyone acknowledges that the decision to cut funding for aid was a really difficult decision to make. But it is right that when it comes to the first duty of government being defence.
What about welfare cuts? How do you think that will land with your constituents?
I think what's important is that we're able to get people back to work. I think work is good for people. At the moment, we've got over 1 million young people who are not in education or training or work, and that's why our youth guarantee is so important, so that we do have that guarantee for 18 to 21-year-olds that there will be education or training or help with a job, because it's so vital that people are well enough to get back to work, and getting our NHS waiting list down is a big step towards that.
Luke, do you want us to go into spending cuts?
Yeah, so we're talking about funding and where you find the money for the increase in defence spending. Sir Ed Davies talked about a European rearmament bank, which will draw in private investment, and it will provide the money that we would need to see that step change in defence spending. Ed was one of the first people to talk about increasing to 2.5% and then the route to 3% a number of weeks ago. So it was really good to see him leading on that, and good to see the government commit to it as well. We were really uneasy with the cuts to aid. Monica Harding spoke really passionately in the Chamber about it, because often cutting that spending becomes a false economy. You create issues in countries where they've been depending on foreign aid, especially when the US has been so brutal in their cuts to US aid. So it does need to be balanced. We do need to be really careful that we don't cause ourselves issues further on. So really do plead with the government to look at the European rearmament bank idea, because there's real opportunity in that, and that's something hopefully they can take forward.
David, we've only got a minute or so left, and we started off this chat with me saying that, you know, Kemi Badenoch seemed like she'd had her batteries taken out. I mean, it felt like we had a very different approach from her today to Prime Minister's questions, and it seems that each week her approach seems to change. Are you comfortable and confident in her leadership at the moment?
Now is a time for national unity. Kemi stood up today and she acted like a stateswoman. Putin will be watching, the Kremlin will be watching, and they'll be looking at any chinks in our armour to see where the weaknesses are. So the politics will be going forwards. Where does the money come from, and how and where is it spent? So I will be digging into going forwards. So in terms of the uplift by 0.2% for defence spending, where is that coming from? Because the numbers still don't marry up with international aid. Will the money be spent on Chagos? Because if those things are true, it's going to wipe out that increase. And I think we're going to have to go far faster to give defence the confidence they need so they can procure the right capabilities for our national security.
You think the Prime Minister will have to bring forward this pledge to raise defence spending to 3% of GDP post-2030? That's the current pledge. You think that will have to change?
I think the international system is so volatile at the moment, we need to be sending a strong demand signal to defence so that they can fire up to be able to keep us safe. Peace will be secured through strength in this new world.
Fascinating times ahead. Thank you all very much for joining us and for watching Prime Minister's Questions with us. Catherine Atkinson, the Labour MP for Derby North. David Reid, the Conservative MP for Exmouth and Exeter East. And Luke Taylor, the Lib Dem MP for Sutton and Cheam. Thank you very much, and to Beth Rigby, political editor as well, for taking us through it all. And for you for watching. You are watching Sky News Today. Coming up, we are going to have much more analysis from Prime Minister's questions. As we've been hearing, Sir Keir Starmer says that he will do everything he can to rebuild US-Ukraine relations. That and all the rest of the day's news coming up after this short break. Hello, you're watching Sky News Today with me, Jane Secker. It's 1 o'clock. These are the headlines. Sir Keir Starmer tells MPs he's doing everything he can to ensure America and Europe come together to end the war in Ukraine.
The US, Europe and Ukraine are working together on lasting peace.
Officials in France say the Prime Minister could return to Washington for talks with Donald Trump alongside Macron and Zelenskyy. It comes as the US President tells a joint session of Congress that Ukraine is now ready to return to negotiations about ending the war. China hits back over Trump tariffs, warning that if the US wants a war, it's ready to fight to the end. Here is the Chancellor about to cut the welfare budget. We reveal what Rachel Reeves hopes to include in this month's spring budget statement. And a woman pleads guilty to manslaughter over the deaths of 4 paddleboarders in southwest Wales. Plus, plans are unveiled for how the country will mark the 80th anniversary of VE Day in May. Hello, good afternoon. The Prime Minister has told the Commons that the UK needs to do everything it can to make sure everyone is working together to secure lasting peace in Ukraine. Sir Keir Starmer was speaking during PMQs as a French government spokesperson said Emmanuel Macron is considering returning to Washington with the Prime Minister to meet Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
We need to do everything we can to ensure that the US, Europe and Ukraine are working together on lasting peace. And I'm doing everything I can to play my part in that, in regular contact with all of the key players at the moment, including talking to President Zelenskyy yesterday afternoon.
If British peacekeeping troops in Ukraine were attacked, whether directly or via proxies, we could be drawn into conflict with Russia. Can the Prime Minister reassure all those who are concerned about the UK being drawn into war?
Minister.
Yes, that's the last thing anybody wants to see. And the whole point of ensuring that there's a lasting peace and that any deal, if there's a deal, is defended, is to avoid conflict, to ensure that we do have peace. The way to ensure we have peace is to ensure there are guarantees for any deal that is in place, because the surest risk that there will be conflict is if Putin thinks that he can breach any deal that may be arrived at.
We need to make sure America does not disengage. There are some in this House who argue Europe should go it alone. But does he agree with me that without this country's greatest ally, any peace agreement would place a terrible burden on Britain and our taxpayers?
Prime Minister.
Well, I do agree with her wholeheartedly, and that's why in the debate we had just 2 days ago, I've always been clear that we need to ensure that the US, the UK, Europe and Ukraine are working together, but we must not choose between the US and Europe. We never have historically, and we're not going to do so now.
Well, in the last few minutes, a bit of breaking news we can bring you from our Security and Defence editor, Deborah Haynes, that she has been told that the US has stopped sharing some intelligence with Ukraine that could be used to launch attacks inside Russia. This is coming from a Ukrainian source. The source said American intelligence sharing has not halted completely, describing the move as selective, indicating this means that the US intelligence would still be shared with Ukraine that could be used to attack Russian forces on Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. And this is, of course, another blow for Kyiv after Donald Trump decided to pause military aid following that difficult conversation with President Zelenskyy on Friday. Well, let's bring in our political editor, Beth Rigby. This story does appear to be moving all the time,
yes,
doesn't it, Beth? There were some questions in PMQs from Ken Badenoch, actually, about whether we should still be intelligence sharing with Ukraine.
Yeah, her argument was, should we be sharing with the US when it comes to Ukraine? And the Prime Minister's very clear that, and reiterated at Prime Minister's questions, that the US is the UK's closest security ally, and we share much intelligence. And this story that's just breaking here from our defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is very concerning, that the US has stopped sharing intelligence with Ukraine that could be used to launch attacks inside Russia. And the source telling her that American intelligence sharing has not halted completely. Look, Jane, it comes as or after President Trump also halted or paused US military aid to Ukraine. And it really seems that the president is really turning the screws on President Zelenskyy to get him to the negotiating table. And you saw from President Zelenskyy yesterday, after President Trump paused military aid, President Zelenskyy putting out a very fulsome statement, which President Trump referred to in his state address to both houses of Congress last night, in which he said, "I want peace quickly. I'm prepared to have an immediate ceasefire," and he outlined the way that could be. And he said he regretted the Oval Office incident, all of which is all designed to try and smooth over these tensions as this gets very delicate. And this, again, is another area of applying maximum pressure to Ukraine. I was talking to one UK official about this the other day, and they made the point that President Trump had said he wanted peace within the first 100 days. He's, on day 42 or 3 of his presidency? And so there's a sort of sense of urgency because Donald Trump doesn't like to fail. And I think within the UK government, there's a sense of this is about applying maximum pressure. And that's what we're seeing publicly happening here. But the UK government won't comment on these sorts of reports unless they come out officially, and that's what happened with the pausing of US military aid. They didn't comment on it. But the hope is, within the UK government, is that they are still working on Ukraine signing that minerals deal, which President Trump is keen on. President Zelenskyy said, I will sign anytime, anywhere. And then potentially the UK, France and Ukraine go to President Trump with the proposed ceasefire deal, which they are discussing and negotiating in order to try and pave the path to peace.